You know, guys, I was watching, or I have been watching some of the SummerSlam reviews from both XMV and Off the Ropes Show, but I want to focus right now on the Off the Ropes Show because, well, let me first of all say this about XMV. With all due respect, I love NoDQ.com. I love Talk Wrestling. You know, I respect the fact that Jeff Meacham knows what it's like to be in the business. But come on, Jeff, let's be serious. Do you think anybody's going to buy the fact that you and Mike Nagel have been sitting at a desk for the past 20-something days without sleep? Huh? You think people are going to buy that? I don't think so. Just saying. I'm just saying, maybe you ought to start changing your clothes a little bit when you do these kind of things. Make it more believable instead of less believable. But speaking of believable, that gets me to my topic here, as I want to address the Off the Ropes Show's SummerSlam review. You know, they've been doing the SummerSlam reviews just like XMV has, from the first SummerSlam up to the most recent, which was last year. Getting ready for this year's SummerSlam in less than 2 weeks. Okay. Now, some of the things that they pointed out during the SummerSlam eras, they said some of them were good, some of them were downgraded. Now we have to admit that the SummerSlams of the late 80s, early 90s, they were mediocre at best. They were okay. They weren't the best, but they were okay. They had some decent matches, they had some faulty matches, but they were okay. But then, if we got out of the early 90s and into the mid-90s, that's when, you know, they started saying some of the SummerSlams started to waver away, started to suck. And they said some of the reasons for this was some of the gimmicks. They point out some of the gimmicks that they got a kick out of, like Bob Holly's spark plug gimmick, Triple H's original Hunter Hearst Helmsley gimmick, and things like that. Well, as you probably point out, or have probably pointed out, and will point out, the gimmicks really started to sort of die off a little bit, if you know what I mean, as we got more into the mid-90s and late 90s. But here's why they started to die off, if you will. But here's why they were also established. See, back then, and even sort of right now, but sort of getting out of it, back then, the WWE, or WWF as it was known at the time, had all these gimmicks because they were trying to make it very cartoonish, if you will. They were trying to attract not just the adults, but little kids. That's why they had the gimmicks of a Bob Holly as a spark plug. That's why they had, you know, a legend like the Iron Sheik. Believe it or not, this does go into that cartoonish kind of deal, be repackaged as Colonel Mustafa. That's why they had the guy that would go on to be known as the Godfather, go from Papa Shango to Colonel Mustafa. That's why they had all this. This is why they had a guy that Jeff, you dislike more than anything, Jeff Jarrett, Eric, go from who he was down in Memphis to being a country singing sports entertainer. You know what I mean? Things like that. This is why you had, even going into the mid-90s, you had things like the body donnas. Stuff like, yeah, the gimmicks were dumb, but some of them were meant to attract kids. This is why you also had Doink at the time still. You know, Doink was, you know, when he was first portrayed, he was an evil clown. Then he became a good clown. Then, you know, this is why you had Jerry Lawler shoved down our throats, if you will, during the mid-90s, during SummerSlams. Because not only was his gimmick in the WWF kind of cartoonish as the evil king of wrestling, someone you wanted to see get beat and dethroned, but it was also due to his partnership of USWA and WWF. So that's why he was always shoved down our throats, as you would put it. But, you know, overall you have to admit that besides some of the crazy gimmicks that they gave us, they had some decent SummerSlams and decent SummerSlam matches. Yes, like I said, some were faltered, some were not. You know, the whole Dr. Isaac Yankem deal that Bret Hart had to go through, or the whole Hakushi deal, or the 1, 2, 3 thing. Again, these were all basically sort of cartoonish characters to attract in the kids. I mean, it's like nowadays, WWE is sort of like blurring the line a little bit. WWE is sort of blurring that line. Because here you have John Cena, who attracts to both kids and adults, if you will, and he's sort of supposed to be blurring the line between a reality-based guy and a cartoonish-based guy. You know, the same could be said for guys like Rey Mysterio and Sin Cara. You know, same could be said for, I don't know, Sheamus, maybe, if you want to look at it that way. Maybe not. Basically what I'm saying is that it doesn't matter if the gimmick was bad or not, or if it was cartoonish or not. At the time, WWE, and they've even said this. You go watch Legends of Wrestling NWO. They even mention this. At that time, during the mid-90s, the early to mid-90s, especially after Hall and Nash left, they employed basically around 180 employees altogether. I know that sounds crazy, but it's true. This includes the wrestlers, and the wrestlers and the divas. They employed around 180 of them. So, you know, at the time, to show that, you know, to show that they weren't afraid to, you know, showcase some of the talent, they allowed some of the talent to compete on the pay-per-views. Yes, some people may say it should have been used for other talent, but you know what? That was WWE, WWF at the time, and at times still is. And at the time still is. But you also got to look at it this way. They wanted to get, the reason they put some wrestlers on there is they wanted to get them over, if you will. Hakushi they wanted to get over. They wanted to get over Barry Horowitz. They wanted to get over the Body Donnas. They wanted to get over all these people that, even despite how stupid the gimmicks were, or despite how stupid and cartoonish the character was, they wanted to get them over because they wanted people to either, if they were portrayed as a face, to really get behind them, or if they were portrayed as a heel, to really boo the heck out of them. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? I mean, again, I know that you feel that some of the matches at all these SummerSlams, some of these gimmicks shouldn't have been and shouldn't have happened, but you know what? Unfortunately, you weren't in charge of WWF at the time. If you were, yeah, maybe you'd change it around, but unfortunately you weren't. You know? And, you know, speaking of some of the matches, I know where you're coming from with some of these. Some of them you felt were unnecessary, some of you felt were not chemistry enough, and some you felt just fell and shouldn't have been like main events of any of the pay-per-views. For example, you brought up SummerSlam 1994. Okay, you brought up SummerSlam 1994. You brought up its main event, which was Undertaker versus Undertaker. Okay, now first of all, I will admit I didn't actually ever see the match. I still got to look back and watch it myself. But I will say this: if it wasn't as good as it should have been, which I'm guessing it probably was kind of wavery, depending on who you ask. You got to realize that Mark Calloway, Undertaker, was working with Brian Lee, the fake Undertaker. You know Brian Lee from ECW? Brian Lee, known as Chains, I think, or Skull. You know, Chains, I think, from Disciples of Apocalypse. You know, you gotta realize that at that time, just like with the USWA, WWF, WWE or WWF at the time had an agreement with Smoky Mountain Television, Smoky Mountain Wrestling, SMW, Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and they, just like WWE, would send their superstars over to WWE, just like USWA sent theirs. And sometimes they send them as who they were, or they would have them under a different gimmick. It's like when they would come back to the Smoky Mountain region, it'd be like, okay, that's Brian Lee. But when they would be sent up to WWF, they'd be like, oh, that's The Undertaker. You get what I'm saying? That's why many, perhaps in the eyes of many people, you know, it wasn't as good as it should have been. But you got to realize, Brian Lee was probably hadn't been in the business, I don't think, that as long as Mark had been. So, you know, you got to kind of look at it that way. Maybe he was nervous because he was in the main event. And he was main eventing with somebody that was growing into what he is now, an established, phenomenal legend. So, there you go on that. And then you want to talk about the two main events that followed the following year. Now, I will admit with you, Razor Ramon and Shawn Michaels probably should have closed out SummerSlam 1995. I will give you that. Because these guys really know how to put on a show. But what you got to realize is both were baby faces. And both being baby faces, you can't really close out the show that much anymore back in those days. So basically the way you want to close out the show is by having the hero beat the villain. And at the time, Kevin Nash, Diesel, was the hero. He was the good guy. He was the champion, and Mabel, or King Mabel as he was known as, was the villain. So, anyway, you gotta realize that by not having Shawn Michaels and Razor as the main event, which I agree should have probably happened, you got to realize that at that time it was more about the cartoonish way of doing things, and the cartoonish way of doing things was to have the hero, you know, was to have the hero let the crowd go home happy. In this case being Diesel. In this case it's Diesel that's the hero, and it's Mabel who's the villain. Yeah, the match probably was atrocious. I will not deny that. I mean, not many people can work with a 500+ pound man in the main event. Not many people can do that, and not many 500+ pound men can pull it off well. And then the following year, you talk about Shawn Michaels and Vader. Yes, Shawn Michaels had his problems back then. Yes, he was very egotistical. But what you got to realize is Shawn Michaels, again, just like Diesel the year before, was portrayed as the good guy, as the babyface. But if not more so, with WWE going through this transition, he was also looked at as the WWE's version of the pop teen star. The pop teen star. He was looked at as their, back then, as their, believe it or not, as their Justin Bieber or their big time Rush guy. That's how he was looked at. That's how he was looked at, as a Justin Bieber, big time Rush kind of guy. And for him to go up against a guy like Vader, that again was to send the people home happy. Now you mentioned that Shawn had to yell at Vader to move. When Vader was on the ground, Shawn wanted him a little further down, right, in the ring, so he can hit the elbow. You got to realize one thing about Vader. Yeah, he's contributed a lot to the business. There's no doubt about it. But I'm not an insider or anything. I just report what I read. But I will say this: it sounds like to me, perhaps Vader didn't want to basically move for Shawn, and probably feeling that as though, hey, I'm being brought into the WWE here, I should be getting over. You know, he probably didn't want to deal with the fact that, you know, hey, here I am in one of the main events of the Big Fab. I'm a former champion all over the place. I'm not about to, you know, do what this kid says because I have more experience. Which could be true. Which could be true, but I think also, in my opinion, it wasn't just Shawn's fault at the time. I'm not trying to defend Shawn Michaels, but I think it wasn't just Shawn's fault. I think in a way that Vader didn't like the fact that he had to put Shawn over. Vader probably felt like many felt that, hey, I should have at least one title reign as WWE Champion, so at least I could say, I've done it all. I've done it all. I've been the WCW Champion. I've been All Japan Champion, IWGP Champion, and now I'm WWF Champion. That's how he probably felt. That's why he probably, you know, as some people would put it, wasn't very workable with Shawn in that match. But again, you gotta realize that Shawn Michaels was the WWF's guy at the time. But the reason he lost the title back in Survivor Series months later to Sid was due to the transition that WWE was noticing that wrestling was going to. Not just thanks to NWO, but thanks to ECW. That's why, going back to the whole gimmick deal, guys, the whole gimmicks thing started to die off a little bit going into the mid-90s. The cartoonish way of things was still there, but not as much anymore, not as prevalent as it used to be, all due to the fact that you had the NWO being established in WCW, and you had ECW really knocking down the doors with their company. So that is why that despite, again, how you feel about the gimmicks, and despite how you feel how certain matches should have been, that is why sometimes SummerSlam isn't as good as you would hope, but you gotta accept it. You gotta just tolerate it. Again, like I said, the gimmicks, they lasted up until about just around the mid-90s, mid to late 90s, and that was all due to the fact that NWO and ECW were knocking down the doors of wrestling. They were changing the face of wrestling. In WWE, they looked at it, Vince McMahon looked at it like, oh shit, I gotta change, or else I'm gonna fall behind, and people are gonna go follow these people, follow this company, they're gonna follow that company because of that organization. See, that's why Vince did what he did. That's why Vince did what he did. That's why Vince did the whole ECW invasion at the Manhattan Center, because he knew he had to get ahead, or at least try to get ahead again. And that's why he did what he did. That's why, you know, he paired in '96. That's why he paired Mankind, Mick Foley, with The Undertaker at SummerSlam. Not just to get Mick Foley over as Mankind, but to get over to the fact that, hey, we're slowly starting to become more than who we were. You know, that's why they gave Dustin Rhodes that Goldust gimmick in late '95 when he arrived into '96. Because they wanted to establish the fact that they were trying to slowly progress, slowly transition out of the cartoon gimmicks. I mean, yeah, the cartoonish gimmicks and sometimes some of the matches that they put on, yeah, those were slowly going away. But they were still there. They were still there because some fans still liked them. There was still a fan base for them. You got to realize when Barry Windham came there as the Stalker, do you think he liked being the Stalker? No, that was a cartoonish gimmick for him. Do you think The Rock deep down liked going from Flex Cabana to Rocky Maivia? No, he didn't like that, but he got him over. It got the fans to hate him so much that when he became who he was, it got him over. Do you think Mark Merrill liked going from being Johnny B. Bad to the Wild Man? No. He probably was more at home when they did the Marvelous One deal. I'm not really sure. Again, do you think, what I'm saying, do you think a lot of these people like the gimmicks they're given? Of course not. But they deal with it because it's either going to make them or break them. And depending on if they're in a match with this, while still going by this gimmick, at say one of the big 4 pay-per-views, they know that it's either going to make them or break them there too. But they also know that if it makes them, they could probably change with the times. If it breaks them, they'll probably have to be repackaged as something else. And that's why, despite how you feel about the gimmicks, that's why they lasted as long as they did, up until, like I say, the late 90s, in 97 and 98 and all that, when they started to really die off for a while, because WWE started to realize, hey, you have this company here in WCW who has this very real established group called the NWO, basically doing whatever the hell they want, being gangster-like, and that's probably where they got the idea for the gang wars between the Nation, the DOA, and the Los Barricas, and even DX later on. But then you also have the fact that ECW was pounding down their throats too with their extreme nature and violence. So, again, you know, the gimmicks and the matches you saw at SummerSlam may have not been the best gimmicks people could be given, but it was basically to see either it's going to make or break them. And some of the matches they were put in, yeah, maybe they weren't some of the best matches, but again, just like the gimmicks, it was either going to make them or break them. And I know this video went a little long, but that's just my reply to the Off the Rope Show SummerSlam reviews so far. I mean, I know you guys haven't done them all just yet, but these are just my replies to you guys on them. Comment down below if you like anybody. Tell me what you think. Do you agree with me with what I said? And that's all I'm going to say right now, and I'll talk to you all later.